There are moments in the history of covert operations where what happened in a single room with only a handful of witnesses shaped decisions that affected millions of people. This is the story of one of those moments. In the late afternoon of a day in 2003, a senior CIA officer walked into a secure briefing room at an American intelligence facility. He was going to hear about a military operation. He would leave that building 5 days later with a resignation letter in his pocket, and he would never return to the agency again. His face would not appear in photographs. His name would not appear in official documents. By the standards of intelligence work, he would simply cease to exist. But his actions would echo through the archives of government, a silent testimony to what happens when conscience confronts institutional power. And conscience refuses to look away. The intelligence community in the spring of 2003 was in a state of profound disquiet. The invasion of Iraq had been launched just 6 weeks earlier, in March, at 2 a.m. Baghdad time. President George W. Bush had authorized the operation. The official narrative was firm. Weapons of mass destruction had been found. Military operations were proceeding according to plan, and the mission was a straightforward military campaign with a clear objective. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had predicted a rapid conclusion. Military commanders had been given timelines that measured the conflict in weeks, not months. The American public had been assured that the intelligence about WMD was rock solid, that it came from multiple sources, and that it had been analyzed and reanalyzed by the intelligence community. Behind closed doors, however, in the corridors of the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, a very different conversation was taking place. The intelligence that had been used to justify the war was crumbling. Assets were reporting nothing. Analysis teams were being quietly reassigned. Senior analysts who had expressed skepticism about the WMD estimates were being marginalized. And the operations that were being conducted in Iraq by British and American special forces were taking on a character that no one in the official record had anticipated. What was supposed to be a surgical war against a hostile government was becoming something more ambiguous and more troubling. The fog of warfare was mixing with the fog of intelligence failure, creating a kind of murk that nobody wanted to examine too carefully. The British Special Air Service, known universally as the SAS, had been operating in Iraq since before the invasion officially began. They had been there in small numbers, gathering intelligence, establishing observation posts, making contact with opposition groups and tribal leaders. Some of these pre-invasion operations had been conducted in cooperation with American Special Operations Forces, particularly units from the Joint Special Operations Command. But by late spring of 2003, their mission had evolved into something more aggressive. They were conducting reconnaissance and direct action operations across a region of western Iraq that intelligence services believed contained not only weapons manufacturing facilities, but also senior members of the Saddam Hussein regime who had escaped the major combat operations. The legal framework for these operations was murky at best. The United States and the United Kingdom had no United Nations authorization for these activities. They were not being conducted under an official occupation framework. There had been no vote in Congress authorizing special operations in Iraq beyond the basic AUMF that had been voted in October 2002. There had been no vote in Parliament authorizing the operations. They existed in a legal gray zone that nobody wanted to examine too closely. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessments suggested that senior regime members were transiting west toward Syria, where the Assad government was providing safe haven to former regime officials. The pressure on the SAS was to find and apprehend these individuals before they could escape the region entirely. The CIA officer in question had spent his entire career handling clandestine operations. He had worked in Central America in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, had managed asset networks in Nicaragua and El Salvador, had been present at the birth of the CIA's counterterrorism programs after the 1998 embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania that had killed more than 200 people, and had been deeply involved in Afghanistan during the early days of the war, on terror after September 11th. He had been in Islamabad in October 2001, working with Pakistani intelligence services to coordinate operations against Taliban and al-Qaeda forces. He had managed sources who reported on Taliban movements. He had been involved in the planning of operations that had led to the capture and interrogation of detainees. He understood the necessity of gray zones in intelligence work. He understood that democracies sometimes conducted operations that couldn't be admitted to exist. He understood that terrorist threats had to be met with aggressive means. He had told himself these things many times over the course of his career, and he had generally found the arguments convincing. But there were limits. There were lines that, once crossed, meant you were no longer fighting terrorism or pursuing national security. You were something else entirely. You were simply committing crimes and clothing them in the language of statecraft. After 25 years in the intelligence service, this officer believed that he understood where those lines were, and he believed that he would recognize when they were being crossed. The briefing began with a map, a region in western Iraq near the Syrian border, an area known as Al-Anbar province. According to the account, a British SAS patrol had been inserted by helicopter into a valley approximately 70 kilometers west of Baghdad, in an area that the briefing materials indicated was believed to be a transit route for Ba'athist regime members fleeing to Syria. The patrol consisted of 8 men. 4 were SAS soldiers. 4 were what the briefing materials delicately referred to as liaison personnel from friendly regional services. The CIA officer understood this terminology. It meant interrogators. Professional interrogators who did not work for the American military, did not have American supervisors, and therefore existed outside any system of accountability that could be monitored by oversight committees. The mission was classified as a reconnaissance and capture operation. The objectives were listed in the briefing document: locate suspected senior regime elements, gather intelligence about their movements and connections, facilitate their apprehension and extraction. The briefing officer, a young Army major who did not seem comfortable with what he was about to present, clicked through a series of satellite photographs. The valley was remote. The nearest friendly military position was 50 kilometers away. Radio communication would be sporadic. The team was tasked with establishing a hidden observation post overlooking a road that intelligence assessments believed would see movement of high-value targets within a 48-hour window. The operation proceeded as planned for the first 16 hours. The SAS patrol inserted without incident. They established their observation post in a limestone outcropping that provided 360-degree visibility of the road below. The hidden camp was prepared with military precision, interlocking fields of fire, escape routes prepared, equipment cached in fallback positions. The soldiers were professionals. They waited. At approximately 14 hours into the observation, a convoy of 3 vehicles approached the observation post from the north. Intelligence photographs were being documented. Thermal imaging indicated the presence of 4 to 5 personnel per vehicle. The briefing materials indicated that the appearance of the convoy matched the intelligence assessment that had predicted the movement during this window. And then something happened that nobody in the SAS patrol's pre-operation orders had quite addressed. The CIA officer leaned forward in his seat during the briefing. He could see where this was going, and he didn't like it. The convoy stopped approximately 200 meters from the SAS observation post. 3 men exited the first vehicle. They were armed. They appeared to be conducting some kind of technical inspection of the road, possible anti-vehicle measures, possible IED placement, possible construction work. The briefing materials did not provide clarity. What the briefing materials did provide very clearly was what happened next. The SAS patrol opened fire, all 3 men were killed. The briefing document indicated that following the gunfire, one of the remaining men in the convoy attempted to radio for assistance. That radio message was intercepted by the British Tactical Operations Center that was providing overwatch to the patrol. What happened next was the reason the CIA officer found himself in a secure briefing room listening to a young major describe events that seemed to violate a series of agreements and understandings that had been meticulously documented over the previous 18 months of planning for the Iraq operation. The man who had begun to radio for help was grabbed by one of the liaison personnel. The radio transmission was never completed. The man was bound. The remaining personnel from the vehicles were also forcibly extracted from the convoy. Nobody was firing at the SAS patrol. Nobody was approaching aggressively. The vehicles had been disabled, but the personnel had not been killed. They were now prisoners. And then, according to the briefing document, the liaison personnel had informed the British soldiers that they would handle the prisoner interrogation. The CIA officer requested that the briefing be stopped. The Army major, who was clearly uncomfortable with his role as the messenger of this particular story, asked if there was something unclear about the material being presented. The CIA officer said that there was, in fact, a great many things that were unclear, and that the briefing should not continue without representation from the Judge Advocate General's office, the CIA's legal counsel, and the Deputy Director of Operations. The Army major said that those representatives were in fact already on their way to the building, and that he had been instructed to provide the CIA officer with the full chronological account before the legal review began. What emerged over the next 3 hours was a portrait of an operation that had spiraled far beyond its stated parameters. The liaison personnel had interrogated the prisoners for 6 hours. The methods used were not described in detail in the briefing document, but the language employed was careful and precise. Stress positions, water immersion, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation. These euphemisms had been carefully developed over the preceding years by lawyers in various government offices who had determined that certain techniques, if performed according to specific protocols, might fall outside the legal definition of torture as it had been narrowly construed in a series of Department of Justice memoranda. The briefing document noted that no permanent physical injuries had been incurred, as if that were the relevant metric for whether a war crime had been committed. The definition of torture employed in the government's internal memoranda had intentionally focused on the likelihood of severe physical harm or lasting injury, a formulation that conveniently excluded methods that caused profound psychological trauma without leaving visible marks. At the end of the interrogation period, the prisoners had been transferred to a detention facility operated by cooperative regional forces, which was the euphemism for an informal prison run by local tribal leaders who had been equipped with American money and British weapons, a system designed specifically to create plausible deniability by removing the appearance of direct American involvement. But there was more. The intelligence that had supposedly justified the observation post mission, the assessment that high-value regime members would be transiting the road during the 48-hour window, had turned out to be completely false. There were no regime officials in the convoy. The 3 men who had been killed on the road were civil engineers. They were conducting a survey of existing road conditions for a reconstruction project being funded by the United Nations. The prisoners who had been taken and interrogated were their assistants and support staff. They had been in the area doing their jobs. They had happened to stop near the location where a British military unit had positioned itself for purposes that had nothing to do with their presence. The legal implications of this were staggering. American soldiers and officers could claim, under various legal authorities, that combat operations in Iraq fell under traditional military rules of engagement. The British could claim the same, but the liaison personnel were different. They were not military. They were not accountable to any military chain of command. They had effectively kidnapped 5 civilians based on faulty intelligence and subjected at least one of them to torture. And they had done so on the basis of information provided by the CIA's own intelligence division. When the legal representatives arrived at the briefing room, the conversation became very different. The Judge Advocate General's representative began asking questions about the source of the intelligence that had supposedly placed high-value regime members on that road. The answer was not reassuring. The intelligence had come from an asset who had been recruited in Kuwait 3 weeks prior to the operation. The asset had been paid $5,000 for the information. The asset had told his handlers that he had overheard conversations suggesting that senior regime members were transiting west toward Syria. The asset had no direct access to this information. He was a taxi driver. He was reporting gossip. He had been given $5,000 to confirm what American intelligence services had already decided they wanted to believe. The CIA officer sat through the subsequent discussion in mounting horror. Nobody in the room was arguing that the operation had not occurred. Nobody was arguing that the interrogation methods had not been employed. What they were discussing was whether there existed sufficient legal cover post hoc to justify what had already been done. There was discussion of the President's 2002 authorization for the use of military force against Iraq. There was discussion of the language in that authorization that allowed for operations against anybody deemed to be assisting hostile forces. There was discussion of the somewhat creative interpretation that could define the liaison personnel as military personnel for purposes of legal accountability. There was discussion of whether the interrogation of prisoners by non-military personnel might not fall under the specific criminal statute that prohibited torture because of the way certain key words in that statute had been defined in memos that had been written by the Department of Justice and were too sensitive to be widely distributed. The CIA officer listened to all of this. He listened to the young major explain that the prisoners had subsequently been released after 2 weeks, so perhaps no permanent harm had been done. He listened to the JAG representative explain that without clear documentary evidence of severe physical injury, prosecution would be difficult. He listened to a representative from the Deputy Director of Operations Division explain that the operation had, in fact, gathered intelligence about regional movements that could be valuable for future operations. And at that point, the CIA officer stood up. He asked to be excused. He walked out of the secure briefing room, returned to his office, and locked the door. What he did in the following 72 hours was not immediately apparent to his colleagues. He did not attend meetings. He did not respond to routine communications. On the 3rd day, he requested a meeting with the Deputy Director of Operations. When he arrived at that meeting, he brought a manila folder containing 4 documents. The first was his resignation letter. The second was a detailed account of the operation that had just been briefed, including names, dates, and locations, and specific information about the interrogation methods that had been employed. The third was a summary of his concerns about the legal framework under which the operation had been conducted. The fourth was the contact information for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The Deputy Director of Operations, a man named Thomas Harrison, a 30-year veteran of the CIA who had held this position for 18 months, read through the resignation letter without comment. When he had finished, he looked up at the CIA officer and asked a simple question: "Are you aware that what you are contemplating is a federal crime?" The CIA officer replied that he was aware of the risks involved. He was aware that he was breaking classification regulations, that he was violating his secrecy oath, and that he was potentially exposing classified methods to scrutiny by the legislative branch. But he was also aware of what he had just witnessed, and he was no longer willing to be part of an organization that would participate in that kind of conduct. What followed was a negotiation. Thomas Harrison did not try to convince the CIA officer that the operation had been justified. He did not argue about the legal theories that had been deployed. Instead, he offered the CIA officer a choice. He could resign immediately, take his folder of documents, and go home. He would not be prosecuted. He would be allowed to speak to his family and a lawyer before deciding what to do with the information. Or he could understand that cooperating with the Senate Select Committee might be viewed as an even more serious violation, and that there were people in the organization who would see such cooperation as a betrayal so fundamental that it might affect not just his career but his personal safety. The CIA officer understood what he was being told. He was being offered a way out that would allow him to retain his conscience while accepting the reality that official channels would not be responsive to his concerns. He chose to resign. Within 5 days of hearing the briefing about the SAS operation in Al-Anbar province, he had left the CIA. He returned his credentials, he secured a lawyer, and he waited. For 3 years, nothing happened. The operation remained classified. The prisoners remained in detention. The intelligence that had supposedly justified the mission remained unverified and ultimately proved to be false. The liaison personnel who had conducted the interrogation were reassigned to other operations in other parts of the Middle East. Then, in 2006, the Washington Post published a story about CIA-run detention facilities in Eastern Europe. The article did not mention this specific operation. It did not mention the British SAS patrol or the convoy of civil engineers, but it did mention the methodology. It mentioned stress positions and water immersion. It mentioned the use of foreign liaison personnel to conduct interrogations in ways that might not be immediately attributable to American personnel. And it mentioned that the intelligence that had justified many of these operations was often questionable and came from sources of uncertain reliability. The CIA officer, now working as a consultant for a nonprofit focused on international law and human rights, read the article and made a decision. He contacted the reporter. He provided information about the operation that had caused him to resign. The reporter conducted additional research. American military records from the time period were requested through FOIA litigation. British military records were requested through similar mechanisms. And slowly, the full picture began to emerge. According to the account, the 3 civil engineers who had been killed on the road had been identified. Their families were located. It emerged that one of them had been the father of 2 children. Another had been engaged to be married. The third had been responsible for supporting his aging mother. The prisoners who had been detained and interrogated reportedly included a young man named Khalid al-Azawi, who had been working as a surveying assistant. Al-Azawi had reportedly been held for 14 days. He had been subjected to waterboarding on multiple occasions. He had been placed in stress positions for extended periods. He had been interrogated about the whereabouts of regime officials he knew nothing about. Al-Azawi was eventually released, but he left Iraq in 2005 and emigrated to Sweden, where he sought asylum. In his asylum application, he described the interrogation in detail. The Swedish Migration Board, operating under international conventions that obligated them to investigate credible allegations of torture, began a preliminary inquiry. The inquiry did not lead to prosecution, but it did lead to a formal finding that al-Azawi had likely been subjected to torture, as that term was defined under international law. By 2008, the operation was no longer secret. It was discussed in academic papers about the war in Iraq. It was analyzed in books about the CIA and special operations. The SAS soldiers involved were never publicly identified. The American officers who had authorized the operation were never prosecuted. The liaison personnel from the Foreign Intelligence Service who had conducted the interrogations were never held accountable. But the operation became symbolic of something larger, a moment in the war on terror when the institutions of 2 democratic nations had collectively decided that certain legal and ethical constraints could be waived if the cause was sufficiently important. The CIA officer who had resigned never spoke publicly about his experiences. He did cooperate with researchers and did provide information that appeared in the Washington Post story, but he did so anonymously and has maintained his anonymity to this day. In interviews conducted for various documentaries and academic projects, he has been identified only as a senior CIA official who was present at critical briefings in 2003, or a former intelligence officer with direct knowledge of operations in Iraq. His identity remains protected not by classification regulations or legal constraints, but by his own choice to remain outside the public sphere. When the Washington Post reporter approached him, the first question the officer asked was whether the reporter had evidence of the operation independent of what the officer was going to tell him. The officer explained that he did not want to be the only source for the story, that he wanted confirmation from other sources and from military records. He wanted the story to have credibility that did not depend entirely on his testimony. And so the reporter began a process of research that involved requesting documents from the Department of Defense, searching through military archives, finding other people who had been present at various points in the operational timeline. What emerged was a mosaic of evidence. An officer from the military legal staff who had been concerned about the legality of the operation, a helicopter pilot who had been involved in supporting operations in Iraq, a translator who had worked with the SAS patrol. None of these people independently corroborated every detail that the CIA officer had provided, but together they corroborated enough to make the story credible. According to this account, the story was published in 2006, did not identify the SAS patrol by name, did not identify the CIA officer by name, and did not even explicitly state that the operation had involved the SAS specifically, though the details were sufficiently specific that anyone with knowledge of British military operations in Iraq would have understood what was being described. The story reportedly appeared in the Washington Post on a Sunday morning in October 2006 and was then picked up by news organizations around the world. Within a week, the story had been discussed in Parliament. A Liberal Democratic MP asked the Defense Secretary whether the government had any comment on allegations of detainee abuse by British forces in Iraq. The Defense Secretary responded that the Ministry of Defense took allegations of abuse seriously and that any credible allegations would be investigated. But he did not confirm that the operation described in the Washington Post story had actually occurred. He did not name any officers involved. He did not commit to any specific investigation. He simply made the statement that was necessary to respond to the parliamentary question and then moved on. What happened after the story was published is interesting because what happened was almost nothing. There was no official inquiry. There was no investigation. There were no charges brought against any of the British or American officers involved in the operation. The SAS soldiers involved were not interviewed about their role. The American liaison officers were not questioned. The matter simply disappeared from public attention. In the years following 2006, the British government would eventually acknowledge that abuse had occurred in some British detention operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and would settle lawsuits brought by Iraqi detainees for millions of pounds. But the specific operation that the CIA officer had resigned over was never formally acknowledged as having occurred. It remained in that category of events that probably happened but that nobody would ever officially confirm. The officer himself, by having provided information to the journalist and having risked his career and his personal safety to do so, moved to a different life. He took work with a nonprofit organization focused on international human rights law. He consulted on legal matters related to the treatment of detainees. He worked with lawyers who were trying to hold people accountable for torture and for violations of the Geneva Conventions. And he maintained his anonymity, even when it would have been advantageous for him to make his identity public. When human rights organizations asked if they could publicly credit him as a source, he declined. When researchers wanted to conduct interviews with him for academic projects, he agreed only on the condition that he would not be identified by name. He had made a choice to act, and he accepted the consequences of that choice, which included a kind of permanent exile from the institutions he had once served, and a kind of permanent anonymity in the larger historical record. What his actions accomplished was to pierce the veil of classification that had surrounded the operation. He demonstrated that there were people within the intelligence establishment who were willing to sacrifice their careers to maintain fidelity to the law and to basic principles of human rights. He also demonstrated that the institutions of American intelligence, for all their resources and sophistication, were not hermetically sealed against the intrusion of conscience. There were people within them who could still recognize wrong and act on that recognition. The officer's decision had been made in solitude, in the locked office where he spent 3 days contemplating what he had witnessed. He had no assurance that anybody would listen. He had no assurance that his resignation letter would accomplish anything. He had no assurance that his concerns would be taken seriously, rather than being dismissed as the perspective of someone who had lost his nerve or who had developed an unrealistic sensitivity to the grim necessities of national security. But he had made the decision anyway, which is perhaps the most important aspect of what he did. He did not calculate the likely political impact of his resignation. He did not wait to see if other people in the agency agreed with him. He did not try to find allies who would support his position before he took action. He simply decided, based on what he had witnessed, that he could no longer be part of what was happening, and he acted on that decision. The SAS soldiers involved in the operation continued their careers. Some of them rose to senior positions within the special operations community. Others left the military and pursued different paths. None of them have ever spoken publicly about the operation or about their role in it. They were following orders. They were working with liaison personnel from a friendly intelligence service. They were responding to intelligence assessments provided by their American counterparts. They were operating in a region where the distinction between soldiers and civilians had been deliberately obscured by an insurgency that did not wear uniforms and that deliberately positioned weapons and command posts near civilian populations. In the culture of special operations, these are sufficient explanations for most actions. The doctrine of command responsibility allows soldiers to defer to the judgment of their commanders and to follow orders without being held personally accountable for the results. But there was, for at least one senior American intelligence officer, something about what happened in that valley in Al-Anbar province that could not be absorbed into the category of acceptable military conduct. He had read the same field manuals that governed military operations. He had read the Geneva Conventions. He had read the definitions of war crimes that had been established at Nuremberg and that had been elaborated in subsequent international treaties. He understood what the law said about the treatment of prisoners, about the use of interrogation methods that constituted torture, about the distinction between military and civilian personnel. And he understood that what had been described in the briefing violated all of those laws. The negotiation between the CIA officer and Thomas Harrison lasted for 6 hours. At one point, Harrison asked the officer whether he understood what it would mean to cooperate with Congress. He explained that members of Congress had their own staffs, that those staffs would likely pass information along to journalists, that the information would be published, and that when it was published, the CIA officer would be identified as the source, or at least as one possible source. He explained that the CIA had been successful in prosecuting people who had leaked classified information, that the investigation and prosecution of Bradley Manning was ongoing, and that there was institutional will to pursue such prosecutions. He explained that the officer's career was already over, but that his life could get much worse than simple unemployment. The CIA officer listened to all of this. He understood the stakes, but he also understood something else, something that Thomas Harrison seemed to be struggling with. He understood that what had been briefed was wrong, and that the rightness or wrongness of something did not depend on whether it was politically convenient for institutions to acknowledge. By the end of the negotiation, Thomas Harrison and the CIA officer had reached an understanding. The officer would resign. The officer would not be prosecuted for having read classified material or for having had access to classified briefings. The officer would not be prosecuted for discussing the operation with a reporter, as long as the officer did not directly provide classified material. The officer would be allowed to speak to journalists as long as the journalist did not publish classified information, and as long as the officer did not technically violate his secrecy oath by releasing documents that bore classification markings. This was a legal fiction, and both men understood it. But it was a fiction that allowed the CIA officer to maintain his conscience without bringing down the full prosecutorial machinery of the U.S. government on himself. The officer walked out of that meeting with a clear understanding of what his resignation meant. It meant the end of his career in intelligence. It meant the end of his professional identity. It meant that he would spend the remainder of his life explaining why he had left the CIA under circumstances that were unusual but not disastrous, that he had been treated reasonably and had not been persecuted, but that he had chosen to leave because of ethical concerns about something that he could not name. For the rest of his life, he would be unable to discuss what had actually happened because discussing it in detail would expose him to potential prosecution. He would be unable to write a memoir. He would be unable to give interviews on television. He would be able to speak only anonymously and only through intermediaries to journalists who had demonstrated their reliability. That the officer was willing to walk away from a career in intelligence to risk the consequences of violating his secrecy oath, to potentially face prosecution for cooperating with the legislative branch, to lose his pension and his security clearance and his professional reputation, to transform himself from a senior intelligence official into someone who could never hold that kind of position again, tells us something about the magnitude of what he believed had occurred. It also tells us something about the limits of institutional loyalty. There are moments when individuals within institutions choose their conception of the law and their understanding of basic human decency over the interests of the institution itself. The CIA officer's resignation did not stop the war in Iraq. It did not lead to prosecutions. It did not prevent the continuation of similar operations. Similar operations, in fact, continued for years. They continued in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in various black sites that the CIA operated in other countries. But the officer's resignation did create a record. It did ensure that somebody who had been present at the briefing, somebody who understood the implications of what had occurred, somebody who had the knowledge and the authority to recognize what had happened as wrong, had testified to what happened, not publicly, not immediately, but through the channels that eventually made their way to journalists and to researchers and to the historical record. History remembers. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is all that we have left to offer as testimony to the fact that wrong was done and that somebody noticed and somebody cared. What the CIA officer's resignation revealed was not just the existence of a particular operation in Iraq. It revealed the broader architecture of a system that had been constructed in the aftermath of September 11th to allow the interrogation and detention of prisoners in ways that violated international law, but that could be plausibly denied by the U.S. government. The system worked as follows. The CIA would identify suspected terrorists or regime officials. The military would capture or apprehend these individuals. They would then be handed off to liaison services that were not technically American, so that interrogation could be conducted without being subject to American military law or to the oversight mechanisms that Congress had established. The liaison services would interrogate the detainees using methods that violated international law. The intelligence that was obtained would be passed back to American intelligence agencies and to the military. And then the whole operation would be classified so deeply that it would be nearly impossible for any oversight body to examine what had actually happened. The construction of this system had been deliberate and methodical, developed over a period of approximately 18 months following the September 11th attacks, and refined further following the invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001 and early 2002. It represented a conscious decision by senior officials to create what amounted to a shadow detention and interrogation program that would be insulated from public scrutiny, from congressional oversight, and from the constraints of international law. This system had been constructed deliberately by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Lawyers from the Department of Justice had written memos explaining how certain interrogation methods could be characterized as not constituting torture, even though those same methods had been prosecuted as war crimes when used by other countries. Lawyers from the Defense Department had written memos about the scope of presidential authority to conduct military operations without congressional approval, and all of this was done with the understanding that it would allow the U.S., my government, to conduct operations that would be illegal if they were conducted in a manner subject to public scrutiny and legal oversight. The CIA officer had been a participant in this system. He had understood how it worked. He had benefited from it in his career. He had approved operations that fell within this framework. But when he was briefed on what had actually happened in that valley in Al-Anbar province, when he understood that the system had resulted in the kidnapping of civilians and their torture, when he understood that the intelligence that had justified the operation had come from a source of almost comically unreliable provenance, he decided that his own institutional loyalty was less important than fidelity to the law. He decided that the rightness of things that he had done before did not obligate him to remain silent about something that he believed to be wrong. This is perhaps the most important aspect of what the officer did. He did not resign based on abstract principles. He did not resign because he had become generally opposed to the war on terrorism or to American military operations. He resigned because he witnessed something specific, because he understood its implications, and because he decided that his conscience could not accept it. This is a form of institutional resistance that is rare and that is difficult to sustain. It requires the individual to accept the consequences of acting on conscience rather than hiding behind the collective decisions of the institution. It requires the individual to accept that he will be punished, that his career will be destroyed, that he will be exiled from the institutions he has served, and it requires the individual to accept that his actions might not have any immediate effect, that the government might simply classify the issue and move on, that he might spend the rest of his life watching the institutions he objected to continuing to function without any accountability. This kind of moral courage is rare in institutional settings. Most people, when confronted with institutional power, choose to conform rather than to resist. They rationalize their participation in systems that they find ethically troubling. They tell themselves that the system is larger than themselves, that individual moral objections cannot change the system, that attempting to resist would only result in their own destruction without producing any beneficial outcome. These rationalizations are not entirely wrong. Resistance to institutional power is usually costly, and it often fails to produce immediate results. And yet the officer's actions did have effects. The fact of his resignation became known to journalists and researchers. The information he provided became part of the historical record. The operation he objected to became part of the documented history of American conduct during the war on terrorism. This history will eventually be used by future generations to understand what happened, to judge what was done, and to determine what needs to be changed to prevent such things from happening again. The officer's resignation was a single act of conscience, but it was an act that echoed through time.